Welcome. My name is Rebecca Lowe. I'm the Adult Program Coordinator with the Lewis Public Library, and thank you for joining us this evening. Welcome to our Spring 2025 Science and Society Lecture Series, subtitle Making Sense of the World Around Us. This lecture series is co-organized and moderated by Fred Dilla, Executive Director Emeritus of the American Institute of Physics and author of Scientific Journeys, Linda Dilla, former Public Information Officer at the Jefferson Laboratory in the U.S. Department of Energy, and Colin Norman, the former news editor at Science. So with that, I am going to turn the floor over to Colin. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca, and welcome everybody to the first of our Science and Society 2025 talks. Thanks also to the library for putting on these talks for now 5 years. We're in our 5th year of these talks. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome my old friend Tim Appenzeller for this first talk. Tim, as you know, is the news editor at Science magazine, which is a great position from which he can survey the world of really hot science. He runs a team of reporters literally and editors literally around the world. Before he came back to Science, Tim was at many of the top scientific magazines. He spent time at Nature, National Geographic, and Scientific American. So he has a great resume for talking about the hot science of 2024. He's going to be going through 10 of the picks that Science magazine made for really significant scientific developments in 2024. And those of you who have seen him give this talk in the past, you'll know we're in for a really hot tour of some of the best science in the world. So let me pass it on to Tim. As we go along, Fred and I will probably make some comments and some questions on some of the topics. But please put your questions in the chat, and we'll relay them to Tim either as we go along or at the end. So Tim, over to you.
Well, thanks, Colin, and thank you all for joining this evening. Let me share my slides here. How to do this? That should do it. All right. Well, let me start by saying a little bit about Science, where I work. It's first and foremost a scientific journal, one of the most prominent in the world, and it publishes original scientific findings. But it also has a news department made up of journalists, which I lead. And we benefit greatly from this front row seat that we get on the top science. Every year we do this sort of celebration of the year's science. We pick what we think are the top developments of the year. We do it by a thorough but not really scientific process. Lots of nominations from the journalists on my team and from the journal editors. Lots of discussions, sometimes some heated arguments, sometimes an intervention by the editor-in-chief. But we apply a bunch of different criteria. These are not just the most important things in science. Importance is part of the criteria, but also impact on society or potential impact on society, and just sheer wonder, the kinds of things that change the way you look at the world. So we pick 10 top developments, 9 are runners-up, and 1 is a winner. And we publish them in an issue at the end of the year with a lot of help from our art department, as you'll see as I go along. This is the cover from last year. just a couple of weeks ago. I don't think you'll guess what our breakthrough of the year is from the cover. That's okay. It's meant to be a tease. So what I'm going to do is count down through the 9 runners-up, and then there will be a reveal at the end. So some of our top 10 are useful, and some are just sort of awe-inspiring, as I said. And this is definitely in the latter category. So this idea that I'm going to talk about is kind of an add-on to plate tectonics, which is this idea that Earth's surface is broken up into these very large, slow-moving plates that move across the surface of the planet and jostle together and pull apart. And this idea explains a lot of things about the planet. It explains where mountain belts are, where volcanoes and earthquakes tend to concentrate, the shapes of continents and the shapes of oceans. But there are still mysteries, and a lot of them have to do with the middles of continents. One is the location of big areas of uplift, big plateaus like this one in South Africa. And another is the strange volcanoes that bring diamonds to the surface. They're very deep-rooted. They are not found where other volcanoes are found. They often are found in the middle of continents. So last year, scientists tied both of these phenomena to the Earth's mantle, which is the very deep layer of hot rock between the crust and the planet's iron core. The mantle is solid, but because it's so hot and under such high pressure, it actually flows at about the rate that fingernails grow. And the idea to explain these plateaus and volcanoes is that when plates rift apart, creating new continents or opening an ocean like the Atlantic, it sets off waves in this slowly churning mantle. And those waves move under the newly formed continents. As they go, they can erode heavier rock from the base of these continents. You can think of the continents as rafts floating in the mantle. And the waves erode away their bottoms, make them lighter. And so where the waves are eroding the continent, it rises by a kilometer or two, and you get plateaus. This process also creates a mixture of rocks that is prone to melting and erupting all the way from the mantle to the surface. And that's the origin in this theory of the diamond-bearing volcanoes. So what kind of support is there for this grand idea? Well, the big development last year is that people looked at the timing when these plateaus and volcanoes formed and related it to when these rifting events happened. And they found that the timing works. The plateaus and the diamond volcanoes start to form a few million years after a rifting event. And the lag grows longer as you move into the interior of a continent. The volcanoes and the plateaus emerge later and later, just as if waves were rolling beneath these continents. So the idea is now is gaining a lot of acceptance, and it's not going to be useful. Probably it's not going to tell us where to find more diamonds, but it is a way of looking at the planet with new eyes.
Tim,
Next, yeah.
Tim, before you go on, I think you explained that very well. I find it amusing that after almost a century after we geologists accepted how the continents drifted apart, that we've come up with a major new force that explained a mystery that geologists just sort of shrugged their shoulders at. How come in the middle of a continent when things ought to be cold and not moving, we have these large kilometer-high plateaus? Well, they figured it out. And then the rough diamond for this discovery was figuring out how diamonds come. So it's really, I'm surprised it's only number 10 on your list. Those are, if you're a geologist, you'd rate them higher.
True enough, and people are really hailing this as a kind of a conceptual breakthrough, up there with plate tectonics. I should say that these numbers are not meant to be rankings. The breakthroughs are all equal.
That's good.
Yeah, it's just for the purpose of the countdown. So this next one, though, is definitely useful. And if you worry about it, even if you don't buy organic vegetables, you probably think about the pesticide residues in your food. And it's not just, the concerns about pesticides don't just have to do with human health. These are pretty indiscriminate poisons, these things we use to control the insects and other crop destroying pests. And so they also damage things that we like honeybees and monarch butterflies. So last year was we saw a big step forward for quite a beautiful idea. Instead of killing pests with a sort of indiscriminate chemical poison, why not attack a gene that is unique to that pest? And biologists have a way to do this. It's called RNA interference. And the idea is that if you put a length of RNA, double-stranded RNA, in a cell that matches the sequence of a particular gene, it will keep the cell from making the gene's protein. And if that's a vital protein, then that cell and whatever creature it's in will die. So that's what biologists did last year. Now you think of RNA as a sort of an exotic laboratory molecule. This involved making RNA by the ton. And also, it's also fragile. So the researchers had to find ways of protecting it as it's sprayed on a field and as pest insects eat it and it gets into their gut. But they succeeded, and the first RNA-based pesticide was approved by the FDA last year. It's aimed at the Colorado potato beetle, which does something like $500 million worth of damage each year. And it's likely to be just the first of many. These RNA pesticides are in the works for a citrus pest called the psyllid, for the mites that attack honeybees, for bark beetles that attack pine trees, even mosquitoes. It's probably not a panacea. Pests are notorious for developing resistance to pesticides. But in the meantime, it's very nice to have a strategy that will poison only the pests and not the rest of us.
So Tim, the real advantage of this obviously is that it will hit just one species, unlike DDT and other chemicals. It doesn't wipe out a whole lot of beneficial pests. But you mentioned that that there could be resistance that builds up to this RNA. But I was wondering, since the RNA, the interfering RNA attacks RNA naturally, presumably the resistance would come from that natural RNA building up mutations. Couldn't you then adapt the RNA, the interfering RNA, to deal with those mutations?
That's a nice idea. I suppose it's possible that the resistance could come from other genes that evolve to replace the function of the one that's being interfered with. Certainly, people talking about this development didn't rule out resistance as a possible problem, although some did say that it's less likely to be, these are less likely to be disabled by resistance. But definitely its other advantages are pretty compelling. So here's another plant-like thing, but this has to do with the history of life. These images aren't much to look at. But what they show is a very early innovation in life, when cells first got together to make multicellular organisms. The assumption had been that this didn't happen until 550 or 600 million years ago, which is just before you start to see very complex organisms in the fossil record. Probably heard of the Cambrian explosion, when the ocean filled with all these bizarre, complex animals. And people thought that multicellularity had happened just not very long before that. But these little fossils, which are from a formation in China, are 1.6 billion years old. And what they're about 20 cells long, is filamentous green algae. You can actually see the divisions between the cells in these pictures. They look like the partitions between rooms. So that's a billion years ahead of schedule. The scientists who found them did chemical tests on these fossils and found that they are indeed plants, algae, not just sort of random chains of bacteria, which sometimes form but aren't really multicellular. So these raise a new question. What was life doing for that billion years when you had multicellular forms, but complex structures, many layers of cells and organs and so on had not emerged yet? Well, maybe the answer is waiting there in the fossil record. Given the scale of this surprise, there may be others yet to find.
In the magazine's write-up of this, you noted that these multi-celled organisms, if you can call them that, were first reported in 2015, but in an obscure journal, and people didn't really take much interest in it. I thought that was really fascinating, the way that science works. Now they've come back and they've got, I think you reported 278 new specimens of this, so really nailed it down. This is, I think, just as a cell fanatic, I find this really fascinating.
Yeah, no, it's interesting that they had to, the discovery had to be made multiple times before people took it seriously, or even noticed it, I guess. So this is very different, but also really fundamental, just like that early evolution of multicellularity. It's a new kind of magnetism. I may need Fred to help me with this one because it's rather obscure, even though it's profound. So what most people think of magnets, the kinds of things that stick to your fridge, are ferromagnets. And the reason they behave the way they do has to do with the atoms in them. Because of the way the electrons in the atoms spin, the atoms can act as tiny bar magnets. And in a ferromagnet, all those little bar magnets are pointing in the same direction. So the material has a net magnetism. Ferromagnets are useful for all kinds of technologies, including data storage, because you can flip individual atoms to record bits of information. Well, there is another kind of magnet that scientists have known about for about a century. It's called an antiferromagnet. And in antiferromagnets, those little atomic scale bar magnets point in opposite directions. Adjacent atoms point in opposite directions. So the material has no net magnetism. And in fact, an early use of these antiferromagnets was as a shield against magnetic ship mines. So they block magnetic fields. And they're useful for data storage as well. The spins can be flipped. It's much harder to do it, but they're more stable. Well, a few years ago, scientists proposed that there was yet a third kind of magnetism that combines features of both ferromagnets and antiferromagnets, and it's called altermagnetism. So this graphic is an attempt to show what's going on. I don't know. It's pretty. I don't know how much it will help. But the idea is that adjacent atoms have opposite magnetisms, as you can see from the colors. The colors are meant to show the direction of magnetism. But the atoms themselves can have different orientations relative to the crystal structure of the material, which is different from in the well-known kinds of magnets. And the result is a material where you can flip spins more easily than an antiferromagnet, but they're very stable. And that combination of properties could have all kinds of technological uses. So this was a theoretical idea, but last year, scientists found altermagnetism in a material called manganese telluride. And they've since realized that it's probably in dozens of other materials, and they're thinking about how to put it to use.
Well, Tim, you did a very good job explaining something that's rather complicated. You wouldn't think a magnet would be complicated. We all know magnets, playing with them as a kid or with our kids, and sticking them on our refrigerators until we use stainless steel, which is not a magnetic material, so it doesn't work. But magnetism, to really understand why it worked, it's taken 100 years. In fact, you will hear a talk by Dava Sobel in April in this series, who just finished a book on the Curie family. And Marie Curie's husband, Pierre, was the first to really understand standard magnets. In fact, there's something called the Curie point named after him. But we really did not understand magnetism until we understood atomic physics and the fact that individual electrons acted like little spinning tops. And they acted like little spinning magnets. And whether they pointed in the same direction or in opposite directions, they had different effects. And the practical application of this is the one you mentioned, and that is to make computer chips and computer memory chips that just rely on flipping the little spins up or down. And that doesn't require much electricity. And you've heard this, I think all of us have heard the stories of these huge data centers being hogs of electric power. So anything that will allow us to produce electronics that use less power will help us. And that type of electronics is called spintronics, based on these little tiny magnets. So you did a great job on a complicated subject.
That's great. Bit of a struggle. So, but I'm going to have an easier time with this one. So this is Starship. It's Elon Musk's giant methane-powered reusable rocket, and it is really big. It's it's taller than the tallest redwood, and it could, in principle, it could put 100 tons of cargo on the moon, which is twice as much as the Apollo, as the Saturn V moon rocket. But best thing about it is that it could make getting to space really cheap, or relatively cheap. And that's what scientists are excited about. Right now, it costs thousands of dollars to put a kilogram of mass in orbit. And Musk says that Starship could drop that to $10 a kilogram. And I did a little figuring, and that's less by weight than the cost of a business class ticket to Europe. So that would be amazing. Musk may be exaggerating. That's possible. But if his rocket flies often and really is reusable, it will certainly lower costs a lot. And last year there were a series of test flights, and they culminated in one in which you probably saw the engineers managed to catch the first stage of the rocket in the launch tower, right where it had taken off from. In principle, there it was ready to be gassed up and launched again. So that bodes well for this thing being reusable, and bodes well for low costs. Scientists are excited because right now space probes have to be as light as possible and as reliable as possible, tested to the nth degree, because launch costs are partly because launch costs are so high. If a probe malfunctions, you may not get another chance. So cheap launches are liberating. You can cut back on the testing. You can make the probes heavier, which means cheaper, and you can make a lot of them. SpaceX, Musk's company, plans to use Starship to launch zillions more of its Starlink communications satellites. But scientists are talking about launching lots and lots of mirrors that could assemble in space into enormous telescopes, or herds of rovers that could go to Mars and fan out over the surface and explore the planet really efficiently. So this has a lot of promise for space science as well as for getting to Mars and other things. And scientists are rooting for it.
You're right, Tim. The key point is what it could do for the cost of doing science with launching a satellite that perhaps gives our weather data at the moment, or communications, or the robotic missions to the near and outer planets. These cost a fortune because the launch cost is so expensive and the possibility of failure is unthinkable. One of your other top 10 we'll talk about in a little while is the James Webb Telescope. That was a $10 billion telescope because it just had to absolutely work, or it would fail. So I think this will help anything that we need to launch into space by dropping the cost, perhaps 2 orders of magnitude. I remember in the old days of the shuttle, if there was a way to transform an ordinary brick to gold, taking it up in the shuttle and bring it back, it was still too expensive to take a brick up in the shuttle.
Yeah, thanks, Fred. Yeah, one sort of marker of how big this thing is the Webb telescope would not have needed to fold up to fit in the cargo bay of Starship, which would have lowered its costs quite a lot because the telescope.
Right, and its complexity, yeah.
So agriculture is kind of a theme this year. And I'm going to try to explain a link between this microscopic marine organism and a possible link anyway, between this microscopic marine organism and the global food supply. So basically nitrogen feeds the world, not the gas in the atmosphere, but fixed nitrogen in compounds like ammonia. Plants use it to make proteins. And without artificial fertilizer that provides the nitrogen, many fewer of us would be alive today. But this little alga is what it is, promises something better than artificial fertilizer. Scientists discovered last year that it and some other plants like it, little one-celled marine plants, have a compartment that acts like a fertilizer factory. It takes nitrogen gas and fixes it for the plant to use. These little compartments are called nitroplasts, and they're probably bacteria that took up residence in some sort of ancestral cell millions of years ago, and eventually became part of it. Basically, the bacteria, traded their chemical talents for food and for shelter within the cell. So this was big news, partly because it was the first new organelle, as these compartments are called, to have been discovered in quite a while. Others are the chloroplasts and green plants and the mitochondria, which are little bodies in our cells that provide chemical energy. But the other reason for the excitement is the hope that it might be possible to take nitroplasts and install them in the cells of crops, plants like wheat and corn, so they could make their own fertilizer. This would be a wonderful thing because it would free the world from its dependence on chemical fertilizer, which requires huge amounts of fossil fuel to make, and is also a big source of pollution. Excess fertilizer runs off from fields into water bodies in the ocean, and causes blooms of all sorts of unpleasant algae and other organisms. This little alga possibly could fix that.
That sounds fascinating, but it also sounds like a real challenge to do that. And I'm wondering if there are any potential downsides. So many advances in agriculture have turned out to be to have side effects or real problems. So I'm wondering if there's any that can be foreseen by endowing crop plants with nitrogen fixing abilities.
Yeah, no, good question. You certainly wouldn't want weeds to have the same abilities. And you could imagine hybrids or some other mechanism by which weeds would acquire this. Yeah, technology always has unintended consequences, and this might too. So this is going from this world to very distant parts. And those of you who listen to this lecture series regularly will have heard some wonderful talks by John Mather, who was the chief scientist of the Webb telescope that Fred was talking about earlier. This is NASA's new orbiting observatory. It's the most powerful telescope ever flown in space, and we could choose its discoveries as breakthroughs every year. Well, this year's, or I should say 2024's, has to do with a puzzle that the Webb uncovered pretty soon after it was launched in 2022. So after the Big Bang, the universe was filled with sort of primordial gas, and cosmologists calculated that it should have taken more than 1 billion years for that gas to coalesce into stars and for the stars to gather into big, bright galaxies. But when the Webb looked back into the earliest days of the cosmos, the most distant reaches more than 13 billion years ago, it saw dozens of bright galaxies. So how could that be? What were they doing there? Well, last year, the Webb started to provide clues. It's a really powerful telescope, and it gathers enough light from these very distant galaxies that the light can be split into spectra, and the spectra analyzed for clues to where that light is coming from. And one set of clues suggested that what made these galaxies so bright was enormous stars, tens or hundreds of times as massive as the sun, burning very bright and fast. Another clue from the spectra said that some of the other bright beacons in the early universe were powered by black holes. And I should say that that might sound like a contradiction in terms. Black holes suck in matter and light, so they should be completely black. But actually, they shine really brightly because as all that matter pours into a black hole, it becomes compressed and heated, and it blazes brilliant before it falls in. So these are clues to the source of these early lights. But of course, they raise new puzzles. How did those giant stars form so quickly? Why was the universe filled with black holes so soon after the Big Bang? Well, the Webb is going to be looking into the depths of the universe for years to come, we hope, and maybe in coming years we'll have answers to those puzzles as well.
Well, again, you've done a wonderful job explaining this. To me, and to I think anyone who's looked at the Webb photographs, you can't believe how breathtaking they are. But for the astrophysicists and the cosmologists involved, as you said, within the first few months, they saw things that they didn't understand. Where did these bright galaxies come from? They shouldn't be that big or that bright that early. And that's the best part of science, when you design an experiment or an instrument and it actually shows you something you didn't expect. That's the wonder of science. And it'll be years before they figure this one out. Hopefully, John Mather and his crew have designed this telescope that it'll be operating for years. That's what their hope is and their estimates. And we'll get to the bottom of this puzzle. We had no idea that the universe was so complicated in its early first billion years.
No, it's the Webb has been so transformative, and the telescope really had a rocky journey on Earth in terms of funding and technology, but it's finally gone up into space and it's working perfectly. So this moves us back to the human scale, even though this image looks kind of cosmic. So some of the most vexing kinds of diseases are autoimmune diseases, which is when the immune system turns on our cells. It starts attacking our own tissue. The diseases look very different. MS attacks the nervous system, something called scleroderma, mainly the skin. Lupus goes after the joints and organisms. But there's a common theme, and that is immune cells called B cells. Now, B cells normally are one of our defenses against infections. They secrete antibodies that attack invading bacteria and other pathogens. But in autoimmune diseases, for some reason, they target the body's own tissues. And right now, a standard treatment for autoimmune disease is immune suppressing drugs, which work, but with downsides. It's not good to suppress the immune system for the long term. So now scientists are reporting amazing success with a repurposed cancer treatment, and it's called CAR T therapy. The idea is to take another kind of immune cell, T cells, and engineer them so that they recognize these misbehaving B cells and destroy them. This is a heavy-duty treatment. It involves extracting a patient's T cells, genetically reprogramming them in a laboratory, then giving the patient essentially chemotherapy to destroy their existing T cells, and then replacing those with the engineered T cells. It's basically a bone marrow transplant. It's risky and expensive. And of course, this kind of treatment makes sense for a disease like cancer. It's used for blood cancers. Autoimmune diseases aren't many are not fatal, and they progress much more slowly, but they can be extremely debilitating. So in the past few years, desperate patients and doctors have tried CAR T therapy, and this year it became clear that it works amazingly well. Dozens of patients have been put in remission, able to lead normal lives after this treatment. And so bigger clinical trials are being launched and in more kinds of autoimmune diseases, and there is a lot of hope for this treatment.
I'm glad this science recognized this particular application. I'm sitting here because of the immunotherapy drugs that science recognized as a scientific breakthrough a couple of years ago. There's remarkable advances occurring on developing immunotherapy drugs, and this particular treatment, CAR T as it's called, was developed, as you said, for blood cancers, but it didn't work very well. We lost 2 friends in the last 15 years with blood cancers. But the initial results, as you say, for diseases like lupus, with just fine-tuning the technique, are encouraging. And listeners on this program, we urge you to tune in on February 4th for our February talk by Dr. Don Lawrence from Massachusetts General Hospital. He's working on this particular technique as his main area of research. So you'll hear more about how this is progressing next month.
Thanks, Fred. So, believe it or not, this is also about a kind of genetic technology. Doesn't look like it, but this is in the distant past. So, one of the most exciting areas of science in recent years has been ancient DNA. So, this is DNA extracted from ancient bones or tools, even from soil in caves where humans or human ancestors once lived. It's revealed all kinds of amazing things. It's shown how ancient populations moved across the world. It has provided evidence that humans and Neanderthals, our extinct cousins, had babies together. And it even revealed a whole new species of ancient human, the Denisovans. But it was expensive. It was sort of one-offs, a sample here and there. The technology has gotten a lot better, and it can be done on a large scale, on dozens or hundreds of ancient fossils at once. What has become possible is to link ancient human remains in family trees. Many specimens from the same graveyard, say. You can say which were cousins, which were siblings, parents and children. It's like, sort of like a 23andMe for the prehistoric world. And over the last year, some amazing insights have been emerging. So, for instance, last year, scientists analyzed DNA from 2,500-year-old Celtic graveyards in Germany. And they could combine the DNA evidence of how people were related with archaeological evidence from the graves that indicated social status, things like the kinds of grave goods and relics that were put in the graves, how splendid the graves were. And what they learned was that Celtic leaders were related through their mothers. This was unexpected because it suggests that power or leadership in these ancient Celtic societies passed down through the mothers rather than through the fathers, as archaeologists had assumed. And stepping even further back in time, scientists recently analyzed DNA from some of the first early modern humans in Europe. Humans migrated into Europe 45,000 years ago from Africa. And analyzing about a dozen skeletons, they found that people scattered over hundreds of miles were cousins. So this points to a sort of small mobile band that scattered across the continent very quickly soon after they arrived. It's really a kind of a wonderful picture of how these first humans in Europe were behaving.
I thought this one was a fascinating choice. And it says a lot, not just about the relationships in ancient societies, but it says a lot of things about how DNA sequencing is now powering virtually all of research. I mean, it was you and I were working together, Tim, at Science in the late 1990s when the human genome was being sequenced for the first time. That took 10 years and about $1 billion. Now the genetic sequences are all over the place. And the reason that they can do the kind of analysis that you just so well described is because there are so many sequences in databases around the world. You can draw inferences by just combining a lot of knowledge. So I think this is just a fascinating area of research, and as you say, ancient DNA has become in the last 5 years or so uh, really advanced. The fact that you can get DNA from fossils so long ago is just astounding to me. So as I say, I think this really illustrates how DNA sequencing is powering so much of science these days.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's really, it's obviously transforming our world, and it's bringing these ancient worlds closer to us. Let's see. Yes, all right. Here is our breakthrough. So the graphic probably won't explain it, but I will try to explain the graphic. So you might think that HIV and AIDS, which is the disease that it causes, is more or less is not such a big problem anymore. But it is. More than 1 million people worldwide still get infected every year, and 600,000 die of AIDS-related causes every year. I was astonished by that number when I was preparing for this. There are very good treatments. People can live with HIV, live normal lives with HIV, but the problem is that many people never know they're infected. So they don't get treated, and therefore they can pass the virus on to others. So it keeps spreading. This is the kind of problem that a vaccine would address. But for decades, researchers have been trying to develop an HIV vaccine, and they have not succeeded. So the world is in kind of a holding pattern. But last year, we got a glimpse of what could be the next best thing to a vaccine. It's a drug that offers almost perfect protection against infection with a single 6-month shot, single shot every 6 months. There was a trial in Africa that was reported last year in 5,000 women and girls. And not a single person who had received the shot became infected. So there are protective drugs that act in the same way. There are pills that can be taken daily, but many people don't take them. There is a 2-month shot, but high costs have stood in the way of that. And doctors, public health experts are way more optimistic about this new drug, which is called lenacapavir, especially because it's now being tested as a 1-year protective, which really, when you think about the flu vaccine or the COVID vaccine, that looks pretty good. And the company, which is called Gilead, has entered an arrangement with 120 developing countries so they can buy the drug at low cost. Now, some middle-income countries like Brazil, which has a major HIV problem, have been left out, but the negotiations are continuing. And if everything goes well, and this drug is rolled out on a large scale, it could really start driving the numbers of HIV cases downward again, and resume the stalled progress. Another thing to say about this drug, and this will take me to the graphic, is that it's an entirely new kind of antiviral drug. Most antiviral drugs attack enzymes that are vital to the virus. Enzymes that the virus uses to copy its genes or to assemble new viral particles. This one targets a different molecule. It's part of the virus's structure. You see those things that look like bunches of grapes. Well, those are actually what are called capsids. This is a kind of protein shell that houses the virus's genes. And the drug, the yellow balls, gloms onto the protein units of the capsid, and it stiffens the capsid. The result of that is that HIV can't slip into the cell's nucleus, which it needs to do to infect a cell, as it normally does, because the capsid is so stiff. The drug also keeps the capsids of new viruses from assembling. So it kind of blocks the virus in two ways. Now, many other viruses also have capsids, and so this mechanism could turn out to be useful for other antiviral drugs. As we all know from the past 5 years, viruses are constantly menacing us, and antiviral drugs are a constant need. So both the promise against HIV, promise really to transform the situation, and this new mechanism for attacking viruses persuaded us that this really was the year's breakthrough.
I think it's a great choice for the breakthrough, and not an obvious one. This is not something that people know very much about. And I think it's the third time science has chosen an HIV intervention as the breakthrough of the year. And that, as I understand it, this new drug was based on a new understanding of the capsid protein, something that both the structure and the function of the capsid protein. And it struck me that HIV is probably the most researched virus ever. It's a relatively simple virus, but simple doesn't mean that it's not very complicated to understand. The HIV was fingered as the cause of AIDS almost 40 years ago, and we're still learning things about this virus. Just to me, that just speaks of how difficult a lot of this research is. I had a couple of questions. Is there any sense of what this would cost, and whether or not it would be available to the places where it's most needed, which is Africa and parts of Latin America?
Yes, I mean, it is the cost in the developed world in the US will be quite high, tens of thousands of dollars a year. But Gilead has agreed to allow generic makers to sell it for a fraction of that cost, a tiny fraction, in Africa, in the developing world, 120 countries. So it seems to have a much better start, a much better chance of being affordable than the 2-month shot that preceded it. There is still a lot of dickering about middle-income countries and whether they will get it at low cost as well. But those negotiations are still going on. So there's a fair amount of optimism that it will be affordable.
Uh-huh. So as I say, a great choice, I think, and maybe at some point in the future, the next breakthrough of the year will be a vaccine.
Yes. People are still pinning hopes on a vaccine, but but this is, they say, the next best thing.
I remember back in the 1980s when Margaret Heckler, who was the HHS secretary at the time, held a press conference when HIV was identified as the cause of AIDS. She said, "Oh, we'll have a vaccine in a couple of years."
Yeah, I think we still have this idea that vaccines are easy, probably based on the tremendous success of the polio vaccine, measles vaccine. But, as HIV and then COVID showed, vaccines that really work and provide long-lasting protection are difficult.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thanks. And I think you've got a couple of slides about breakdowns of the year.
I do. Yes, we can do that unless there are questions in the chat.
There's a couple. What were some of the other 2024 breakthroughs that didn't make the list?
Oh boy. I mean, we spent a lot of time discussing AI, which is, of course, changing the world in all kinds of ways. But we didn't find a single development in science that we were able to kind of elevate as a breakthrough. AI keeps marching on. There's a lot of hope and some early demonstrations that it's going to be very powerful in science. And actually, our breakthrough, when was it? I think 3 years ago, was AI predictions of protein structures. So, one of the big challenges in biology has been looking at the genetic sequence or the sequence of the gene and figuring out what the protein it will make can do. And that depends on the protein's shape. And predicting how a protein will fold into a particular shape has been a huge problem. Well, AI has basically solved that problem. It figures out protein structures, and it can dream up entirely new proteins with specific functions. We're going to see, I was going to, one thing that I can skip ahead to if people are interested, is what to look for in 2025. And one of those things to watch for is drug development. AI can dream up molecules that will bind to specific targets in the body and have specific effects. Right now, a lot of that work is done by trial and error. Having AI come up with candidate drugs is going to speed up drug development tremendously, and we're likely to see a lot of that in 2025.
So there's one comment really from Anne Finkbeiner, who sums up a lot of what I've been thinking. She says, "Tim, how do you do this? Have you edited all the stories and all these subjects so you're not learning all of this just for this talk? I admire your ability to tell us the story, its context, and its science, the storyline and the detail both. Maybe you're a genius."
Well, definitely not that, but thank you. I did do some studying. I did read all the stories before they went in the magazine. So I had a superficial understanding, and I prepared a bit so I could fake a bit more understanding. I wanted to flag two things on what to watch for in 2025. Two things I didn't mention. One is another amazing telescope, and this is called the Rubin telescope, which is opening in Chile. That's it at the bottom of the screen, and it has the world's biggest digital camera. The goal of the telescope isn't to look into the distant universe as the Webb telescope does, or at least not to peer at one spot in the distant universe, but to survey the entire night sky. And it can do that, or will be able to do that, every 3 days. So it should be very powerful at finding things that appear and disappear or move across the sky, which means things like supernovae, exploding stars, comets, asteroids, all these transient things in the sky that are very hard for astronomers to spot, but they'll be seeing them in just huge numbers when this telescope is up and running. And then finally, to leave on a hopeful note, there is expectation that carbon emissions, global carbon emissions, are going to peak in the next year or so, which means that they will decline afterwards. This is because many countries, the US, China, are moving away from coal, at least the US is, and China especially is ramping up clean energy at a tremendous rate. Mostly this is driven by economic forces, and it's a very hopeful change. It is not the end of climate change. We're still pouring carbon into the atmosphere at an absolutely sort of devastating rate, but it is maybe the beginning of a hopeful change that will eventually help us solve this crisis. So if carbon emissions peak, that could be next year's breakthrough. We'll see.
Well, thank you, Tim. We are at the 6 o'clock mark. And I want to thank you for just a wonderful presentation and summed it up. This is it's amazing how you can talk about all of these various areas of science with such authority. So I hope we'll have you back next year, maybe to talk about one of these three things to watch for in 2025. And I just want to thank you very much for spending this time with us. It's been just fantastic. So if people could, I'll turn it back to Rebecca, and if people
Tim, stay on the line, please, afterwards.
yeah.
And then thanks everybody for listening. Enjoyed it.
All right. Thank you. Yes, thank you, everyone. So if you, as is our custom, if you would like to unmute yourself and applaud and say thank you, feel free to do so.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you.
Excellent presentation.
Thank you, Tim. What a great way to spend an hour.
Wonderful. Thank you
Well
so
done.
much.
And thank
Thanks.
you, organizers. Wonderful job.
Sure.